Hillary and Megan, good to go? All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today at HMSC's research seminar. My name is Cinnamon Moffett, and I'm the research program manager at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center, located in Newport, Oregon, and I'll be your host for today. We do have your mics, cameras, and screen shares turned off, but please put your questions into the chat box, which you can find at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on what platform you're using at any time, and we will ask them for our speaker, either if they're relevant or at the end. So please put in your questions. We would enjoy hearing from you. I also wanted to let you know that we are recording today's seminar, and so it will be posted up on our past seminar page in a few days. And if you're not sure where that's at, I just put that link in the chat box. And so you're welcome to share the recording of this video or watch it again if you wanted to review something that you might have missed. Today is a very special day. We have this year's student invited speaker with us, but before I hand it off, I have a couple of really quick announcements I need to make. Wanted to let you all know that next week's speaker, August 5th, yep, already to August, is Laura Lilly from Oregon State University and NOAA's Northwest Fisheries Science Center, who will be giving a talk about analyzing physical drivers of zooplankton variability in the Northern California current. So I hope that you can join us and welcome Lily to Hatfield next week, same place, same time. Also wanted to let everybody know, if you're curious about any of our upcoming events, if you Google or use whatever platform you use, HMSC, go to our homepage, scroll to the bottom, and you will find our calendar of events there. All of the information you need to log into our virtual events is available to you there. So check that out if you're curious. Also wanted to put in a little plug that I'm booking seminars for the fall. So if you or somebody you know would like to share with the Hatfield community, please reach out to me and we'll get them on the calendar. So as I said, today our speaker has been invited by our student group, the HSO. And so we have two moderators from HSO that'll be helping us today. We have Hillary and Megan. Hi, everybody. And they're going to be working with us to coordinate and help Marco with today's talk. So I'm actually going to hand it off to Hillary now. Hillary is this year's HSO co-president. So Hillary, do you want to take it away?
Hi, everybody. It's a great honor to welcome
Hillary, your mic is cut out.
Welcome Marco today as our HSO student nominated speaker. So as Cinnamon said,
do you want to try that again, Hillary?
All right, can you hear me now?
That's better.
Wonderful. Sorry for the delay. Well, welcome to Dr. Marco Hatch, who is this year's HSO student nominated speaker. I am Hillary Thalman. I'm a co-president of HSO and also a PhD student here at Hatfield. And before I start with my introduction to Dr. Hatch, I wanted to first give an overview of the Hatfield Student Organization, which for those of you who are maybe less familiar, the Hatfield Student Organization is a group of primarily graduate students at Hatfield, comprising multiple different departments across the university. And the goal of the Hatfield Student Organization is to provide a space for communication and collaboration between all of our graduate students and also with the faculty and staff at Hatfield. And we also are able to support students through a number of
Hillary, we lost your mic again.
Research awards and travel awards. Cinnamon, can you hear me?
You are very delayed.
Okay, I'm gonna open, can you hear me now?
I can.
Guess the world decided this was a great time to cancel out. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Hatch. He is the PI for the Coastal Community and Ecology Lab at Western Washington University. Dr. Hatch has worked with many Native American communities to create a framework to build collaborative, co-produced research projects around changing food and medicinal systems. As a member of the Samish Indian Nation, a local federally recognized Coast Salish tribe, he has helped create a network of communities interested in maintaining indigenous food systems. Prior to Western, he was the director of the Salish Sea Research Center at the Northwest Indian College. At Western, he continues to create culturally grounded research experiences for Native
Hillary, we lost you again.
American students through the NSF page. Or am I back?
You are back.
Am I back? Great, I'm gonna turn off my camera.
I think that's a good plan.
Sorry about the delay, you guys. Dr. Hatch creates culturally grounded research experiences for Native American students. Through the NSF PAGE program, he leads a 4+2 bridge program, creating opportunities for students graduating with a Bachelor's of Native Environmental Sciences from Northwest Indian College to pursue a Master's of Environmental Science at Western Washington University. And so it's our great honor to introduce Dr. Hatch. Cinnamon and I have created a certificate for you. And we would like to honor you as our student nominated speaker. This will come in the mail to you after today's talk. So take it away, Dr. Hatch.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. And we're back into the Zoom land of black boxes with white text. The talk I've prepared is a bit more of sort of my public talk, sort of like generally what we do and what Clam Gardens are. So looking at the past speakers, we're a bit lighter in the sort of heavier parts of the science that we do. But I think it hopefully gives a good overview of more of, I think, the approach of what we do as opposed to the more in-depth analysis around stabilized slopes, fatty acids, clam growth, whatever it might be. So hopefully I didn't misread the audience on this one. Additionally, there's a number of times I'm going to ask for feedback, but given the restrictions of the Zoom world, I'll encourage you to use the chat feature. So with that, let's look at some pretty pictures and talk about Clam Gardens for a while. Let's see. Go computer. Oh, there it goes. Okay. I'm also having technical difficulties on my end. My mouse appears to be wanting to come in and out of contact. So the first part of this lecture is based on this public presentation many of us in the Clam Garden Network share. So let me get my screen. I've got to get back into teaching mode here and get all my little windows set up just right. So the first part's about how some people grow carrots and others grow clams, referencing some of the practices around Clam Gardens. And this talk has been worked on and shared throughout the network for quite a while. So there's many co-authors on this first part, and then we'll move into a bit more of my specific work. But it's always nice to start with a nice picture. This is from Fulford Harbor, facing south. One of the Clam Gardens just about 15, 20 nautical miles away from where I am in Bellingham, Washington. I'm currently about 30 miles south of the Canadian border. And there's an active restoration of Clam Gardens going on with 10 different First Nation communities just across the border in the Southern Gulf Islands. British Columbia is obviously a very beautiful place, and there's lots of impressive landscapes in that area. I'm going to start off with a bit of a challenge here, and we're going to watch a video together talking about how great British Columbia is. And I want you to listen critically to this video and just kind of write down what it makes you think of, what is missing, and sort of the verbiage that this video uses, and we'll use that then as a framework to go through the rest of the talk. So typically we'd follow with a discussion, but maybe as you're watching or after, just kind of drop your unfiltered thoughts into the chat box, and we'll have a short discussion thereafter.
When I pause, listen, I hear it, the calling, a beacon to return to a place and myself. British Columbia. be amongst the elements, the purest water and air. Fertile abundance, a natural richness that over time has quietly become the true currency of life. And this place is the kingdom of abundance. A land of giants. British Columbia forces you to rethink life's measures. What is big? What is power? What is important? Supreme nature. Supernatural. The thread that connects us all is undeniable in this place that the Aboriginal peoples have honored for millennia. Massive groves, standing giants fed by the climate and the circle of life. Altitude swings that take you from sea to sky, from rainforest to desert to snow-capped peaks. This is the place where wildlife thrives. All in the court of Her Majesty Mother Nature. She chose this place to erect her monuments. Masterpieces forever in the making. Constant and changing. A dichotomy that reflects our refined civilization and raw wilderness. It's the rush of standing on the edge of the world. The deafening quiet of a mystical morning. The exhilaration of British Columbia that reminds you of what it feels like to be alive. To find the wild within. Supernatural British.
This is always the fun part. So, does anybody want to enter into chat how the video stumbling is all right. Portrays, why can I talk today? How discusses nature and what is nature used for? What is how is the relationship between, in this case, the citizens of British Columbia and nature? Or is there anything about the language used, or any general thoughts that the video evokes?
Marco, this is Cinnamon. I can actually create it so folks can unmute if you would like to facilitate that discussion.
This is kind of the only one we're having here. As long as we get some things rolling into the chat, we're okay.
Okay, sounds good.
People are typing in now. It takes a little bit of time to process, and there's that kind of Zoom lag and putting you on the spot. The comments are coming now are nature on display for those who pay. For sure, this feels like a REI ad as well. Yeah, and so it, to me, in the chat's saying this as well. There's some tones between nature is there for us to enjoy, but like more of like it's there as a recreation tool, right? It's there as a luxury, and there's also the line of this dichotomy between refined culture and the raw wilderness, often referring to nature as being the environments of British Columbia being natural and untouched by humans. The acknowledgements of First Nations are around honoring as opposed to having an active role in the environment. And so I think it draws this relationship where we as are users of nature, and nature is there on its own, that prior to the building of Vancouver, that nature had not been altered or messed with, that sort of thing, that it was there by accident. And for sure, British Columbia has a number of really beautiful and diverse habitats. It's also a very culturally diverse area. And so this is a map from nativeland.ca, which is quite good if you're ever trying to figure out whose territory you're on. This is a pretty good tool. And it shows that just this vast number of different tribes and First Nations in this very small area. And this isn't even the entirety of the Salish Sea, just a very, very small area of North Washington and southern BC. And so there's a massive diversity of culture here as well. And one website we probably don't have time to get into, but this is some work from Hakai and Heltzik did this collaboratively, but this is Hoyt. This is an island on the south of Bella Bella, so north of Vancouver Island and south of Haida Gwaii on the kind of inland passage side. There's this island called Hunter, and on the north end of Hunter is Hoyt. And it's one of these places that, this is an image I believe I took from Hoyt. And you stand there and you look out and you're like, oh, it's pretty, right? It's like an estuarine system. We can get excited about the salt marshes and the different plants that are there. And it's one of those places that when I first went there, it's obviously very interesting and beautiful, but you go there with folks that were young children when there was a summer village in this area. And you start to get a different picture of the landscape. You start to understand that just over here is a giant fish trap. It's a giant rock wall in the water at the low tide line that salmon swim into this pool as they move up the river. Low tide falls and the fish get trapped in the pool and you can catch them. This is lined with estuarine root gardens with little rock walls for that. There's a clam garden out here to our left. Up on the hill, there's a bunch of plateaus with berry gardens. That the whole landscape from mountaintop to seafloor bottom is actually been highly modified over thousands of years. And it's really easy to look at it and think, oh, it's just naturally beautiful. But when you start to take the time or develop that right set of eyes, you start to see really the degree of alteration that we have in our environments via thousands of years of Indigenous management. And as ecologists, I think it's important to understand that background, because in this example, the distribution of plants, soil chemistry, and nutrients is all was all highly changed by people for thousands of years. And so, if you don't understand the management systems that built the ecosystems you're working in, you're going to have a hard time drawing mechanistic conclusions between distribution, growth, or abundance of any suite of organisms and those biotic and abiotic conditions that you're trying to tie it to. So I think Hoyt's a really good example of that. This is a quote that we normally break down as well, but I'll kind of help us through it a bit here. So this is a quote from Introducing Anthropology, 2008. It's actually still in the last version I could find was, I think, 2016. It's your kind of general Anthropology 101 textbook, and it states that the Kwakwaka'wakw society was so populous due to the abundance of natural resources, especially the annual salmon runs, when in essence the food came to them. And Kwakwaka'wakw's northern Vancouver Island, sort of between the north end of Vancouver Island and mainland BC. And so this quote is attributing the massive human populations, which massive human populations is true, but it's attributing that to these natural resources when food came to the people. It's implying that individuals could be entirely passive in the ecosystem, that human populations were so abundant due to the abundant natural resources, and indigenous groups did not need to have a system of control, of management, of cultivation, of rules around access and harvest, because there was just so much food. They could just wander around and sit on the side of the bank and salmon would jump into their lap. And so it's setting up this, or it's reinforcing this idea that indigenous people didn't have to, or either lack the knowledge, skills, technology, or lack the need to maintain ecosystems and to be actively engaged in those ecosystems, which kind of goes back to the discovery doctrine and things like that of why you can remove people from the landscape, because they're not actively cultivating it. Therefore, they're not using it to its full potential. We're not going to go too far down that road, but we're going to talk about how people have interacted with the ecosystems for a very long time. And one of those examples are clam gardens. And in the terrestrial realm, plant cultivation, burning, other forms of agriculture under a different form than thousands of acres of corn is increasingly been accepted and acknowledged in a lot of our terrestrial fields. In marine science, I think we're a bit behind, and partially it's because you can stand on the edge of the ocean and look out and it looks vast and unchanged, right? And then thinking about how people would manage an ecosystem like that is pretty interesting. And one thing that has turned the tide of how we think about humans and marine resources over the past few thousand years are these features called, they go by many names. Clam garden is one that's kind of the most accepted English term. But here you can see Nathan Cardinal, who was at Parks Canada at the time, and this large pile of rocks. And if you just look at a beach, you could think, oh, it's just some rocks, like it's a natural feature. And that was thought for quite a while, until a number of geomorphologists started looking at these features saying, there's no way that these can be natural features. People would have had to move these rocks. And it was a source of a major debate until folks asked traditional knowledge holders, and they said, no, those are, in Quaxi language, loki-way, meaning to roll rocks. These are features that we built to improve the clam habitat on the higher tide side. And so this particular feature is over 1 kilometer long. Nathan's a very tall gentleman, and so this wall is maybe 10 feet wide. And then just over here on the seaward edge, it actually drops down to about 6 to 8 feet of water. And so it's this really steep drop off, is this really large feature. Many of these features individually are larger than Stonehenge, but they're not really thought of on that same scale. They represent thousands of hours of labor, of organization, of tending these structures. The oldest ones have been dated back to about 3,500 years before present, but we have no idea of knowing how old, what the true antiquity is, because in many areas, because of sea level rise, the oldest features are now well underwater. The oldest dates we have are actually from Quadra Island, where sea level has actually been dropping there. So we've got some older features that are kind of high and dry now. And so this gives us a very visible example of how people have altered the environment, and lets us ask questions about what mechanisms are at play here, and how does this really work? And as a marine ecologist, you can think about putting all of this large structure in the intertidal that wasn't there prior. Many of the systems that could have either been flat bedrock or a more two-dimensional substrate. Now you're piling up all of these large rocks that are sort of kind of basketball size on average, but putting 1 kilometer of them out in the water provides a large three-dimensional structure for things to grow and live on. Another thing that's pretty interesting about clam gardens, and there's not a lot of technologies that we see that span this boundary all the way from here in Washington State, all the way through British Columbia to Southeast Alaska. There are untold tens of thousands of these clam garden features, representing untold numbers of acres of modified habitat. And I think it's really interesting to think about. You can imagine going to a beach and trying to do you do an intertidal survey or understand the dynamics of that beach. But if you don't know that these rocks are here due to people moving them, you might come to some incorrect conclusions, particularly thinking about wave energy and how that relates to sorting sediment on the beach. Now you have all these large rocks that really shouldn't be there. And a lot of this comes from John Harper, who's that geomorphologist that has flown up and down the coast and would see these sorts of features and present them at geology conferences as potentially human-made features. And it really wasn't accepted at the time. It was a pretty long road for him to get it accepted. But going up and down the coast, you see these large straight lines on beaches that there's no other explanation. Glacial till, other nearshore processes don't explain why you would see large rocks stacked up, typically in a very straight line, which we often don't have in nature, followed by a shallow, typically sandier, siltier substrate that typically houses a fair amount of clams. This is a diagram from Sky Augustine that has the original beach slope and then a pile of rocks at the low tide line, some at the upper tide line. And the general idea is that, and they're quite variable, but the general idea is that you start with a steep beach, you roll rocks to low tide line, and it flattens it out. And we can go in and look at the more recent clam gardens, and it's they're really precise. As we know, in the intertidal, there's a massive amount of zonation, and everybody has their place. And in this case, many of these features were designed for butter clams. And these features are designed at exactly the right tidal height, right in their Goldilocks zone. If the features are too high, clams would dry out and die. If they're too low, the sea stars would eat them. So they're really engineered on the centimeter scale. Great diversity of them. Many of these are from Quadra, where my last master's student completed their work looking at how clams are either undergo variable stress or have different diets, whether or not they live in a clam garden or a non-clam garden. And based on a stable isotope and fatty acid analysis, found that clam garden clams are less stressed than some of the non-garden clams. That led to some different fatty acid profiles. And so there's some, indication that it's kind of hard to tease apart some of the mechanisms here, because you're looking at an ecosystem where people built something in a place for a reason, right? These clam gardens are not built randomly. So we're trying to do a random study. It's a bit hard because you're looking at places people cultivated clams. Are they good for growing clams? And it turns out they are. So it turns out, based on all of the studies that the whole network has done, to my knowledge, it typically turns out that where clam gardens are built are good places to grow clams. So it's sort of reinforcing this notion of really intricate knowledge of the ecosystem and really intricate care in building and constructing and tending, in this case, intertidal resources. A bit of the linguistic evidence. I'll try to keep an eye on the time here. And clams are very important culturally. This is Bill Reed's carving representing Haida in the Raven story, where Raven rescued the first people from a butter clam shell. So you can see the nice rings here on the butter clam shell. So clams are obviously an important food source, but for many groups are part of their origin story, part of the foundation of their culture. Just a few quotes. This is in Quadra. This upper, that's Nicole Smith. This upper clam garden is the one that was dated to 3,500 plus or minus. And this lower one is the new one. That one's 1,800 years before present. This picture was taken before we knew that, but we know that now. It's kind of interesting. A couple quotes. One is clamming was an important part of the year from early on as a young child. And this one's, we spent a lot of time moving rocks. And at the end, I was sitting on the beach and we were looking back at what we'd done. And I said, does that look better now, Grandpa? He said, yeah. And I said, what did we do that for? And he just laughed at me. You don't know, someday you'll know. That last quote I like because that's often the way that traditional knowledge and information is shared, is like very cryptically. And it's like those quotes that you have to think about and come back to sometime later. And in my work in Bella Bella, one of the clam diggers I worked with would always talk about clams bringing Christmas. And it's true at Lummi as well, where we're dealing with a fair amount of fecal coliform issues. And what he meant by clams bringing Christmas is that both in his community in Bella Bella and local Coast Salish communities, one, you can go out and dig clams for the commercial market with very little investment of 5-gallon bucket and a rake. And typically the commercial harvest is in the winter, and our winter low tides are at night. And so you can go out in the middle of the night in December and dig 100 pounds of clams, which you get about $1.50, $1.80 a pound, if that. But you can go out with very limited upfront cost, go out in the middle of the night in the freezing cold, lug hundreds of pounds of clams across the beach, sell them for a small amount of money, but it's that little bit of money right before Christmas. And so for many families, this clam dig is actually what puts presents under the tree. And so when we look at the economics of it, it's really easy to say, well, clams, it's whatever. It's like a couple $1,000 here and there. Well, it's a little bit of money at a certain time. And so it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, the number of presents that clams have provided. In this case, literal presents under the tree. A bit about the Clam Garden Network. So there's we're actually doing I should do a better plug, but we're doing a seminar series now as well around Clam Gardens, mostly targeted at First Nations that want to understand, record, and develop restoration projects within their home reserves. But there's a bunch of us up and down the coast, mostly Washington, BC, and some in Alaska, that have a loose network around asking questions, sharing resources, getting out in the field together and trying to move the knowledge forward about how old are these things, where are they, how do they modify the sediment, and some of the more mechanistic questions about why do we see so many more clams in these features, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then we're also working on, I've got a student working on this rock wall we see behind this group photo. What else is living there? So we have this large 3-dimensional structure in primarily a 2-dimensional space prior. How has that altered the abundance and distribution of intertidal organisms with a special focus on traditional foods? And so in this way, I've kind of gone in a bunch of different directions about clams, but I think it's really interesting to look at a species like that and to say, we can incorporate a bunch of different questions through the same ecosystem, through the same ecosystem and species. We can look at how intertidal management, Clam Gardens, relates to identity. Some of this work in the Southern Gulf of restoring these clam garden features, after 5 or 6 years of doing this, all the First Nations got together to talk about the status of the project as the first phase 1 was twilighting out. And at that meeting, nobody got up and said, clam garden restoration is awesome because now I have buckets of clams. But everybody said and agreed, this project is amazing because it's putting us back on the landscape. It's putting us back in the seascape. It's allowing First Nations and youth to go out, manage the beach ecosystems in ways that we have for thousands of years, but we've been, in the case of Canada, banned from that for the past 80 or 100 years. It's acknowledging our significance on the landscape and seascape. It's getting our youth and our elders out, reinvigorating those traditional knowledges and technologies. And so, like as an ecologist, I think about having my head in the sand for a long time, really just focused on clams and what are they doing and how many there are and how fast they grow. But to kind of pull your head out of the sand for a little bit and look around, think about all of the other ways that different disciplines and values are all tied in through this one singular place is pretty interesting. The same thing is true for changing oceans. The Swinomish community just to the south of us here is working on building a clam garden. And this will be the first clam garden built since contact, to our knowledge. There could have been one very early contact, but it's probably highly unlikely, particularly when you think about a 90% population decline in about 20 years. But this is being done for a few reasons. One is Swinomish is trying to protect intertidal resources in the face of sea level rise. And they're also having a huge piece of it with identity and ritual as well. So reinvigorating that technology within the community and getting elders and youth back out on the beaches. And so it's a really interesting project, and it's just getting going. They completed phase 1 and now they've got phase 2, which is funding. They're going through permits now. We'll see how that goes, but really interesting work. And so we've got restoration happening in a few different communities up and down the coast. The most public one is the Southern Gulf, just across the US-Canadian border. The Swinomish building project is publicly known, and you can find some information on that. And a few other communities that are doing kind of quiet restoration. And so we're engaged in these projects kind of up and down the coast. Unfortunately, the past 2 years, I haven't been able to visit any of the field sites in Canada. But I'm sorry, here just want to make sure okay. We had kid pickup. Let's make sure that got communicated correctly. And so we've seen before in a variety of studies that these features have more fatter, happier clams. We've seen over and over again that when you look at clam gardens, the density, biomass, and growth rate of clams within them is higher than adjacent non-walled areas, 150 to 300% greater productivity. We've been curious, what are some of the mechanisms behind that? And I'll run through these. I think our target's 430, if I'm not mistaken. And so a few years ago, we did some work with the Huxley community, and Huxley is really interested. So one kind of side note that's relevant to this is that if you go back to that nativelands.ca website and you click on treaties, you'll see a lot of treaties in the Western US and very few in Western Canada. The majority of First Nations in Western Canada are operating without a treaty, and Huxley is one of those. So they have a small reserve, and then everything around that's called unceded lands, meaning lands they never formally gave up, and they're undergoing modern day treaty negotiations. And as part of that, they really want Indigenous resource management to be a cornerstone of that. And with Clam Gardens, they were really interested in where they are, how old they are, how many they are, and do they provide a positive ecological impact. And so to use that as part of their negotiations of saying, here's our footprint, here's what we've been doing for thousands of years, let us keep doing that and like effectively leave us alone. And so that was one of the kind of drivers for the questions we looked at. And we planted out clams in gardens and non-clam gardens. These are butter clams. Tag them, stain them. You can see one here. This is how big it was when it was put out. And then this lighter growth is the growth that happened during a growing season. And this is kind of just a rough graph here. But one thing that was pretty interesting is if you look at non-clam garden and clam garden growth rates, proportional growth rates, so taking their size into consideration, you really didn't have a big difference at the lower tide. So if you have a clam garden at the very low tide of the clam garden, the very low end of the clam garden, and a natural beach at the very lower depths. These are Canadian datum. So I think 0.5, 0.2 meter, sort of in that range. There wasn't a big difference. But as you move up the tide line, the non-clam garden clams have a huge cost. It costs them, there's an energetic cost of living higher on the tide line, presumably less time to feed, more thermal stress. In the clam garden, that was pretty mitigated. So you could be a clam living higher on the tide line than you normally would in a non-walled area and maintain a decent rate of growth, which is really interesting. And some of the elders commented on that many of the beaches we were going to are beaches they referred to as places for high water clams. And I think that's an interesting one to think about because now, there's a lot of talk about developing bivalve aquaculture. Bivalve aquaculture is great, but let's be honest, oysters are a luxury good, right? Oysters are $15 a dozen on the low end. Going out and digging clams is typically kind of a luxury activity. Like very few people that are doing it need those calories to survive. Well, in traditional times, that wasn't the case. And if you think about when you can access those resources, summer during the day and during certain tides, during your spring tides, and at winter at night, if you can move the median distribution of the clams just 5, 10, 20 centimeters up on the tide line, your accessibility it opens up greatly. The grocery stores open more often. And so I think that's a pretty interesting way of thinking about it, particularly when you're looking at your winter low tides at midnight. Having more access to the resources is going to be huge. One of the traditional practices is returning shells to the beach. And so here's a clam garden sediment and a non-clam garden sediment. Quite a lot different. This is mostly shell hash. This is kind of an extreme example, but mostly shell hash, meaning broken up shell. A fair amount of barnacle. So a lot of the clam gardens are built with adjacent to bedrock, and barnacles grow fast and die. And it'd be really interesting to calculate how long it would take. So you have a bedrock shoots out in the ocean, and then you build a rock wall along the front based on just that surface area of bedrock and some assumptions of barnacle growth rate, how fast it would take to fill that bathtub you basically just built with nothing but shell from those barnacles. It's something I've been interested in. So if anybody wants to run those maths, let me know. But we do see a lot of barnacle shell in the beach, and this high calcium carbonate load in the sediment. We're making some assumptions, and we've done some testing. It's not really conclusive yet, but one of the ideas is there's some albedo effect there. It's more porous, water flows better through it. There's higher oxygen content deeper in the sediments. Could allow for some interstitial feeding, meaning the clams could be respiring during low tide with the water stuck in the sand. And then some thoughts maybe around benthic diatoms as well. I'll kind of skip over this, but this is just showing that there's more shells in the white one compared to the dark one. This is just a quick shot of density of density in clam gardens versus non-clam gardens, blue being clam gardens and the redder being non-clam gardens. And so we see about twice as many little neck clams in clam gardens and about 3 times as many butter clams in clam gardens compared to non-garden areas. And again, this is for Bella Bella. And so I want to spend a bit of time looking at this beach. And so here's one of those, this is a shockingly small clam garden. I mean, this is like, not even classroom sized. And you see bedrock here. There's a small wall here, and there's another small on the other side, on the other side of Ed here, kind of on the other side of those buckets. And this is a beach that it was one of the first beaches I experienced in Bella Bella. And we were cruising around. We had Elroy White aboard, who's a Celtic archaeologist who studies stonefish traps. And he was going around showing me where a lot of these clam gardens were. And we were talking about study design and what areas are important to the community. And we finished our day. The tide has kind of risen. You can see it's a gorgeous day up in the central coast of British Columbia. So that our tide was too high to do any clam work. And over. I said, hey, there's a stone fish trap around the corner. The crew got really excited, so we're going to cruise over and look at this stone fish trap. And as we cruise in the inlet here, clipping along at full tilt, I noticed this little feature. I said, hey, stop, drop me off here. I want to look at this feature. So they dropped me off on this beach and they continued off to go look at the stone fish trap. And I start walking around and it's just all shell hash. It's just all broken shells, just a layer of whole shells on top and then just crushed shells all the way below. And you reach down and with two hands, you can just pick up this big pile of sediment and it's just chock-a-block full of butter clams, just butter clam on top of butter clam on top of butter clam. And I'm just kind of beside myself. I've never seen so many butter clams in one spot. And so I'm kind of nerding out on the clams. And then I start to wonder, hey, I wonder if they're gonna come back and get me. And so I walk up to the top here and I look down the other side of the bedrock and you can see abalone shells, you can see fish swimming around in the clear, cool water. You can look off in the distance and see that stone fish trap. And it really hit me there that these are super interesting, valuable, important features, but they're part of the network of Indigenous resource management. They're part of a really complex food system. And while they're an important, cool piece, it's equally important to sort of take our head out of the sand and look at the entire landscape, look at how all these systems are related, how people moved around. And in this case, a beach that not only is gorgeous, beautiful, and full of clams, but also challenged all of my assumptions based on my knowledge of butter clams. Here's a massive density, just literally clam on top of clam, and we're way, way too high for clams. We're way above what the textbooks say, and apparently the clams in Bella Bella don't read the textbooks because these guys are, I don't know, we're plus 1.5, 1.7 meters in Canadian datum. I mean, way, way, way high, and just completely full of clams. And so going back to that idea of access, this is really, really interesting, of having clams that you can dig at almost any tide, and butter clams no less, in massive densities. Really kind of drove home this idea of complex interconnected ecosystems. And we can quantify that and think about it in whatever the current cool framework is. This was written under the Coupled Human Natural Systems, because we were applying to a Coupled Human Natural System grant. But this idea of thinking about these features, clam gardens, as they interact with the human system and the natural system. And so by modifying a beach, tending the beach, following traditional protocol around which clams you harvest, how you dig the beach, how you turn the sediments over, tending the rock wall, rebuilding it, removing predators, seaweed, things like that. By that investment from the humans, you get increased productivity, you get increased clam recruitment, growth, more biodiversity in the rock wall, increased food access, more things on the menu. And then people also have a connection to that place as well. And that's what we're seeing through the reinvigoration of building and maintaining these, is that reactivation to place as well. And so we can think about how those systems are interacting in this really, this microcosm of a clam garden. And like that prior picture you saw, many of these are quite small. I mean, there's the profound features that are 1 kilometer long, but to me, what's more interesting is all of these little tiny patchworks that are sort of like a modest classroom, 2 offices sized features, a few, 10 meters by 30 or 40 meters at most, really quite small. So thinking about this, like the massive numbers of modification, but just they're very, many small things, many small modifications. So I'm going to jump from that to, got a couple stories, and I've got a little bit more of what we're doing right now. Let's do the cookie story and then a little bit about the boundary span of work, and that should take us to time here. So we're thinking about projects like that. We're working not only interdisciplinary, but interculturally, right? We're working with Indigenous groups in mainstream science. We have a lot of Indigenous partners on the ground, and we come from mostly academic or federal agencies. And so with that, there's a degree of understanding and partnership that needs to happen, and this story is about that. This story was originally told to me by Sky Augustine from the Staminas First Nation, who learned it from her mother, and they've both given me permission to share it. It's called The Cookie Story. And the cookie story starts with these two groups that have traditionally had their differences. That have had some troubles over the years, and they've decided to come together. And they come together in the kitchen where lots of great stories start. And they're in the kitchen and they're saying, we should try to do something together. Yeah, that's a good idea. Well, what should we do? Well, we're in the kitchen. Let's make something. Oh, okay. Well, should we cook something on the stove, in the oven? Should we make a meat dish? Should we make a pasta? What should we make? Let's bake something. Okay, good idea. We'll bake something. How about we each go back to our home community and we get ingredients that are important to us. And then tomorrow we'll bring those ingredients back to the kitchen, and then we'll figure out what to bake. And so both groups agree to this, and both communities, or both groups, go back to their home community. And one group's really excited about this. They're telling people in their community, we're going to bake something together, and what are ingredients that really define us. And they're going through this whole process and spending a lot of time trying to figure out, what can they bring to this collaboration, what's really important to them. And they come back the next day, and the other group has brought cookies. They've brought hundreds and hundreds of beautiful, symmetrical, pre-cooked cookies and some decorations. And they say, hey, you can decorate these cookies. And the other group says, well, we wanted to bake bread. And the foundation of this story is that frequently our partnership between Indigenous and mainstream dominant society, academia, is like that. We typically approach the community with a bunch of pre-made cookies, and we say, hey, can you add some decoration to this? Where a true co-production would be a fair amount different. We would have different ingredients and bring them together and ideally create something that neither one of us could envision from the start. So rather than adding a little bit of decoration to a predetermined project where the scope, scale, questions, duration, sites, budget's all been worked out, and you're just supposed to come on and add a little bit of decoration, what would it look like if we started at a level playing field and work through that together? And as part of some work with Julia Parrish and Selena Appel, we've been looking at that question of, when we look at projects up and down the coast, and we see projects that they're just so good. They have all of the pieces. There's good collaboration. Everybody involved in the project speaks highly of it. How does that work? What aspects? What's the key aspect to those projects? And we started honing it down to an individual. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over a couple things here. And the idea is that individual is a boundary spanner, and that frequently disenfranchised, underserved, underrepresented, non-dominant communities are operating in this space of worry and concern and looking for solutions. I'm worried that red tides are more prevalent now. I'm worried about ocean acidification impacting clams. I'm worried about toxins in the clams, where frequently in established geoscience, our questions may be more academic. And a boundary spanner in this instance is an individual that can bring the tools and technologies of mainstream science to address questions that are focused in solution space and worry or concern. And so we really honed in on this idea of a boundary spanner as somebody that helps develop these really great collaborative projects. In our experience, are in the experience of our boundary spanners really focused on Indigenous mainstream science. But boundary spanner has been applied to the organizational level in many different contexts, to be honest. We certainly didn't invent the word boundary spanner, but Safford all have a good paper from 2017 looking at boundary spanning organizations, land grants, sea grant, et cetera, organizations that are intended to be outward facing and kind of bring the knowledges of the university to the people and questions of the people back to the university. Sort of as an organization, that's what they're supposed to do. But we were really more interested in the individuals. So within those organizations, there are certainly a number of boundary spanning individuals, but really it comes down to, when you look at a lot of these projects, it's one person or a small team of people that are doing the greatest deal of this facilitation. And so thinking back to something my previous boss at Northwest Indian College said, new buildings are nice, but it's the people in them that matter. And so who are the people within these organizations that are really driving this collaboration and facilitation? So we held a number of workshops with 7 different boundary spanners from Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska, and went through detailed interviews, and we're currently almost done writing that up to talk about what their shape is and how having a boundary spanner in these projects helps understand the currency, language, nonverbal cues, protocol, customs, culture in an Indigenous community, and also the same thing, because we have all of those things in science. And so a boundary spanner is being somebody who has credibility in both of those communities, somebody who's accepted as an academic, has academic credentials, but also has standing or understanding within the community. And so we looked a bit about the shape of them. It's typically an individual or small team. An ideal boundary spanner is somebody from that community that also has an advanced degree, and they're acting as the fulcrum of partnership. These are people that frequently listen, they're absorbing the desires, concerns of the community, and understand the tools and technologies of whatever discipline that they're engaged in. But really, above all, wants to protect the integrity of the community. So they're not going to engage in a project that's extractive or is not fully resourcing the community at which you choose to work in. Boundary spanners typically act as a translator, facilitator, frequently advocating for direct funding and protecting the community from inequitable projects. A number of communities are now developing really rigorous protocol around data sharing, data use agreements. There's one community actually in BC now, if you want to pitch a project to them, they demand an upfront consultation fee. And so groups are starting to change that dynamic where, no longer are they being allowed to just be used as decoration. They want equitable amounts of funding, control, and say over what happens in their homelands, which seems like a fair request. And so the ideal vision of partnership from a boundary spanner is long-term commitment. One of the biggest things we hear is that these commitments take a very, very long time. And probably the most useful piece of information is really if there's a group you're interested in working with, like talking to them now, typically, and when I worked at the tribal college, this happened all the time. You would get a request to sign a letter for some projects that you're not allowed to read, the letter of support, 2 days before it's due. You want to reach out well before that. And what I like doing is, here's what I can do. Here's, the things that I'm good at, or my lab's good at, or people I know are good at. And just file that away. And when something comes up, let me know. That sort of approach, as opposed to, hey, there's this really good opportunity. Sorry I didn't talk to you about it. It's due in 2 days. Can you sign this letter and get it back to me by the end of the day? Like, that's not going to work, and happens more often than one would think. And boundaries managers really appreciate particularly people on the mainstream side that can navigate the institutional reporting requirements. In fact, Larry Campbell, Swinish Elder, had a great quote on the workshop we did yesterday. If there's a way around it, we'll find it. So frequently, the things we need to do to make community engagement work, your administration might not like, RSP, accounting, et cetera. We have to find ways to work within the intent of our funding, but ways to make things happen. And so it requires a fair amount of creativity and then saying, not taking the first no as an answer. And ultimately, we're hoping this leads to a more equitable exchange where we in academic circles have certain sets of currencies and communities have a certain set of currencies. And often what we see are academics assume what those currencies are within community. If they even think about them, they assume them, as opposing to ask and having this equitable exchange where we're both getting what we want out of the project. We both have some skin in the game. We both have some benefit, and we're both fully vested in the project. And that comes with both, if everybody getting equal importance, joy, cred, whatever it might be out of that project, that we have to see the benefit in spending all this time working on it together. So I think my timer's supposed to buzz at 4:30 if I'm not mistaken. So I'll wrap up there. Are there any, I guess they can't, you guys can type things. This is a different one.
Megan, can you come on and go ahead and help facilitate the questions in the chat?
Yep, thanks, Simon. We do have one question in the chat. Fantastic presentation. Speaking of the knowledge lost to colonialism, what did you think of Charles Mann's Compendium 1941?
I admit I hadn't finished it. I have it, but I put it down at one point in time, never picked it up. But one thing I've been reading more about is, and it's kind of fun. It's kind of bad because I actually had one of my students pull it out of the paper, but just how populous the Americas were, and that scale of really loss due to disease is hard to fathom. And we did a project on a long time ago around sea otters, and it's likely true for buffalo as well, that there's this big pulse in those fauna after really indigenous population declines on the order of, depending where you are, 90 to 70% in 10 to 30 years, which is, the 90% you could think about. Well, if you think about 9 people in 10 years, they would have all passed away from disease. It's a pretty, it's a hard thing to fathom. And frequently in the work that we do as far as resource management, I refer to as faded footprints, that we're just trying to get a small glimpse of what these systems look like. And it's so hard. You can wrap it in the shifting baselines if you want, but in our part of the world, you cruise around the San Juan Islands and you go to all these small islands that are just a state park, and you feel like, oh, this must have always been this way, right? We've just lost that sight so much. It's really hard to work against.
Thanks, Marco. You're getting some other comments in the chat of this was amazing information. Thank you.
Hey, Sandy, I saw you join there. It's good to see your name.
It looks like Ichan, you have your hand raised. Did you want to unmute and ask a question?
Yeah, Wonderful presentation. Thank you. That was amazing amount of information and something for all of us to think about. I'm curious, you know, in fisheries research, we talk about moving baselines. I'm wondering, when you talk about these ecosystems from the perspective that you've been talking about all this seminar, essentially we're talking about hidden baselines in ecosystem science. Are we not?
Yes, I mean, and I mentioned shifting baselines just a minute ago, and actually that was the big, you know, Polly's 90, I was sure it was 96 or 97, but the tree paper was a big turning point for my career. And I started having all my students read it as like the first assignment in many of my classes. But the idea of the hidden baselines, I like that because I guess you could get some pushback on what's the difference between a shifted and a hidden, but I guess shifted, at least you would, like the basketball shorts example, you've seen that one for shifting baselines of basketball players used to wear shorter shorts, now they wear long ones, but they still wear shorts. Where a hidden baseline would be something that we just don't even see anymore. I like that a lot. I like that a lot. Thank you.
All right. Megan, anything else coming in?
It looks like we have one more question. For non-Indigenous folks who might be interested in working with Indigenous communities to jointly solve environmental issues of interest to tribes, what are some recommendations for how to approach this?
Great question. And we've been, so I'll give an example of how I think an approach came off wrong and how it was corrected. So we have an energy studies program here at Western. They're all great folks, and one of them is actually joint on a new NSF Includes project with me to do food, energy, water with Indigenous lands from all through the West Coast and Southwest. But nonetheless, this group came to me, and it was that very typical, this project's due next week. It was a good opportunity. It was like a 9-to-1 matching for a green energy project but it had to include under-resourced communities. And so they're like, oh no, we need this money, but we need an under-resourced community to get the money. So like, hey, do you know an under-resourced community we can use for this? And it's due next week. And I'm like, well, that's, you know, nice offer, but like, I'm going to decline to get involved in that because, you know, we're on a 1-week turnaround timeline. But I said, but instead, what we can do and what we're building out is the grant is to fund green infrastructure, solar panels. You could buy Teslas, whatever, just something to reduce carbon. I said, let's work with my community. And you have an energy assessment class where the students work with a client and develop, write a plan for how that client uses energy and ways they can save energy. And they do it frequently with, like, an example is a brewery. So they partnered with the brewery, they looked at all the energy consumption of the brewery, wrote a plan, and they came up with alternative solutions. So let's approach the tribe with that idea of, hey, Samish, like, you've got bunch of office buildings, an RV park, you're building a gas station, you have all of this infrastructure, and you have cars that are driving all around. Let's do an energy audit and figure out what are the biggest draws of energy, and then think about, based on the roof space, slope, direction, et cetera, like, what are some potential solutions to reducing your energy footprint? And then we'll go through that process, and then 2 years from now, when that grant comes up again, we'll already have sort of a foundation there. And then the boundary spanner piece is really looking for that boundary spanner. And really, I'm a big proponent of just making those introductions prior to something on the table. one thing that the Quinault's really good at this, Sandwich is really good at this up here, is having projects on the books. And so they'll have every year they'll sit down and think, okay, what are projects we need to get done that we don't have the capacity for? So they might have a whole suite of projects. And your expertise may or may not match them, but at least finding out what they're interested in and then what you have capabilities in, maybe that'll come up to be a match. And so it's really that initial interest. Usually the director of natural resources or some of the division directors, if there are communities in your area that tend to do, some communities do more partnerships than others. Certain communities around here tend to not partner with outside folks as much. And so just kind of knowing that and respecting that would be a good way to start.
Hi, Marco. Really good to see you. I sent you something in the chat. I wanted to say it was a fabulous presentation. The transition between your field sites and science and the broader issues of the impact of colonization was really seamless and thought-provoking. And I really am glad you're doing the work you're doing, man.
Thank you, Sandy. We'll see you soon. Actually, I'll see you. I'm on San Juan next week. We'll talk later. Sorry. I'll send you a text.
Perfect.
As Sandy co-ops our seminar. Appreciate it. All right, everybody, we are running over time, and I believe Marco has other commitments that we need to give him time to get his brain around and get ready to talk to our undergrad students. Is that correct, Marco?
Yep. Yeah. And just Amanda, there are no, our oldest ethnographic evidence comes from the San Juan Islands, but there are no known extant clam gardens in the San Juans. Which question you asked more often? That's a good one. I don't know, Adian. Okay. Thank you all. I appreciate your participation and attendance in Zoom land. And I look forward to coming down and visiting you all, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marco. And thank you everybody online. For the students that are there, I hope that you join Yicheng and Marco for the follow-up discussion. For everybody else, I hope to see you next week at our next week's seminar. So Marco, again, thank you so much. And for our graduate students in HSO, thank you for doing the work to find Marco and getting him here to speak with us. For all of you, thank you so much for your participation and helping Hatfield expand and talk to new voices. So Marco, thanks again for everybody online. I'm going to do the abrupt end. So it's like meeting done for everybody. So it's not the way I like to do it, but I am going to do that. So for everybody, thanks so much. And Marco, we hope to talk to you again. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.